So in today's video, I am taking the Buddha in the cage painting I did and turning it from, okay, it's a nice painting, to, wow, it's a great painting. And I'm going to be showing you some tricks on how to do that.
First, I'll explain my process and intentions with this piece. Basically, how I arrived to the starting point of this video with this artwork. During my watercolor class I just had at Eastern Michigan University, the assignment was to set up not only a still life, but set one up in a space. So basically, creating a space. Some people created their own terrarium or set up items inside of a box. Then after we create our space, we can photograph it and use it for our watercolor painting. So for the container to create the space, I use a bird cage. Up until the point of where today's video started, the piece was done primarily in watercolor. For added punch in some areas, I did use some watercolor pencils, which is a bit easier to control. For the bird cage, I used masking fluid. The concern I had with this piece was that the Buddha was not as well defined and developed as it ought to be. The background seemed to outshine it. I had difficulty using watercolor to fully punch all the values and get all the details within it. Thus, I went in with colored pencil. I was able to really kick in the darkest values as well as the brightest ones. It's also much easier to control colored pencil than watercolor, as watercolor often has a mind of its own. As with any still life setup, it can be made more dramatic and meaningful by the items you choose to display. Both the Buddha and the shell hold significant meaning for me and have its own story behind it. The Buddha I used in this artwork is actually from where Buddha was cremated in India in the Lucknow area. A difficult part of this painting was the curls of Buddha's hair. There's so many. One thing I kept in mind are that these curls are all the same, though in some areas the lighting is different. So I focused on the repetition of shapes between the highlights and shadows to suggest the curls, instead of trying to draw each one accurately. If I deemed his hair a major focus of the painting, I would have gone about this process much differently. Like hair in general, it often looks more realistic to block in the highlights and shadows than to draw every single hair. In the middle of Buddha's face, I noticed the lighting is warm colored, obviously due to the warmth of the yellow colored sheet I used in the background. I used a dull yellow color in these areas before coloring over it in white, just to warm up these strong highlights in the face. I had to do some redrawing in this piece, especially with the ears to further pronounce them. You would normally want to correct these mistakes much sooner than later in the piece, but it's never too late to make these changes because you don't want to leave mistakes in your artwork. Since this watercolor paper isn't smooth, the colored pencil isn't looking smooth either. But once I had my values established, I used a spray fixative over the painting. After this was completely dry, I painted a layer of watercolor over top of it to tie it all together and smooth it out.
आशिक बनाया, आशिक बनाया, आशिक बनाया अपने। तेरे बिन सूनी सूनी है बाहें, तेरे बिन प्यासी प्यासी निगाहें, तेरे बिन बिन नजर मेरी आहें, तेरे बिन ओ आशिक बनाया, आशिक बनाया, आशिक बनाया अपने। जन्म 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 साथ चलना यूं ही, कसम तुम्हें कसम आके मिलना यही। एक जान है भले दो बदन हो जुदा, मेरी होके हमेशा ही रहना, कभी ना कहना अलविदा। हमें तुमसे प्यार कितना ये हम नहीं जानते, मगर सकते तुम्हारे बिना हमें तुमसे प्यार
तुझे संग बैर लगाया ऐसा राना मैं फिर अपने जैसा हो राना मैं फिर अपने जैसा
क्या हुआ तेरा वादा वो कसम वो इरादा भूलेगा दिल जिस दिन तुम्हें वो दिन जिंदगी का आखिरी दिन होगा क्या हुआ तेरा वादा
हाँ सीखा मैंने जीना जीना कैसे जीना हाँ सीखा मैंने जीना मेरे हमदम ना सीखा कभी जीना जीना कैसे जीना ना सीखा जीना तेरे बिना हमदम
तुझसे नाराज नहीं जिंदगी हैरान हूँ मैं हैरान हूँ मैं तेरे मासूम सवालों से परेशान हूँ मैं परेशान हूँ मैं
जो तेरी खातिर तड़पे पहले से ही क्या उसे तड़पाना ओ जालिमा ओ जालिमा जो तेरे इश्क में बहका पहले से ही क्या उसे बहकाना ओ जालिमा ओ जालिमा
जिए तो जिए कैसे बिन आपके जिए तो जिए कैसे बिन आपके
जीने देना जिंदगी तू जीने देना जीने देना जीने देना जिंदगी तू जीने देना
हुजूर तुमको सितारों में ले चलूं दिल डूब जाए ऐसी बहारों में ले चलूं हुजूर
मेरे दिल में जगह खुदा के खाली थी देखा वहाँ पे आज तेरा चेहरा है मैं भटकता हुआ बस एक बादल हूँ जो तेरे आसमां पे आके ठहरा है
ये शाम मस्तानी मदहोश किए जाए मुझे डोर कोई खींचे तेरी ओर लिए जाए
ओ सोनिए तेरा मेरा साथ यूं ही रहना ओ सोनिए हर जिंद मेरी बान रहना
मेरे महबूब कयामत होगी आज रुसवा तेरी गलियों में मोहब्बत
Because I had previously used staples to stretch my watercolor paper, I trimmed up the edges of this piece by cutting off 1 inch all the way around to remove the staple holes for a cleaned, finished look. I also could have just left this, so that way when I frame the piece, I can just mat over these edges. As I'm sure you can tell, this artwork is taking many layers to achieve the look that I want. This is often the case with much of my artwork. After the masking fluid was removed, it was clear to me I'd have to use white acrylic paint in some areas in which the masking fluid did not protect from. As I worked further on the piece, I no longer worried about it painted onto the cage area because I knew I could fix it later.
Thanks for watching. See you soon. Shukriya. Jaldi milenge.